Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Babies in Common Show. I'm Jeanette.
And I'm Melissa. Welcome, listeners.
So today's show, we're going to be speaking about postpartum care with Arlene Lammy. And Arlene's a birth and postpartum doula with her own company, New Wave Perinatal Services. And she comes to birth work with a teaching background in education. She studied secondary education at Syracuse University and then pursued teaching and early childhood education. She taught in various preschools and education centers for over 5 years and led classroom teams as a certified infant toddler teacher, which I can only imagine how valuable that is as a postpartum doula first year.
Yeah, absolutely.
But she came to birth work in a surprising way. She was fortunate enough to be welcomed to witness the birth of her nephew in 2017, and she's going to share more about that with us today.
Very exciting. Arlene is a full circle birth companion trained by Shafia Monroe Birthing Change Consulting and has a keen appreciation for postpartum care that centers traditional African American midwifery practices, which will be some of the focus of our discussion with her today. She was raised by her West Indian immigrant parents on the motto, "It takes a village," and she carries this principle throughout her work with new families. Arlene is also a Reiki 2 practitioner and offers holistic energy support. She resides in Essex County, and we are so excited to have her today with us. And just as a reminder, anything that we talk about in our show today should not be taken as medical advice. Please consult your own care provider for questions about you or your baby's health, and visit babiesincommon.com/disclaimer to learn more. And without further ado, thank you, Arlene, for coming on our show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you guys.
So let's hear a little bit more about you. So we said in our intro, you got inspired to go into doula work after witnessing the birth of your nephew, which is huge when a relative asks you to be there, which is really cool. How old were you at the time?
I was 24, turning 25.
And had you did she know you were interested in birth, or she wanted extra support? How'd that come about?
It was so serendipitous. I was always the baby person in my family, had been babysitting, and again, funny because I was the baby of my sister. And I think just loved infants and loved my job. And I was teaching full time at a preschool then. And when my sister got pregnant, we were talking about when the baby comes and when I would be an auntie and that. And we have an older sister that I have a very large age gap with. So I didn't really get to participate in her kids being babies. So I was particularly excited for this baby coming. But no, we never talked about birth, and we never even talked about her providers. And I never asked questions about, what does your midwife say? I mean, I asked, are you seeing a midwife? That was the first question I asked.
Because you already knew midwives were a good thing.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. And had a strong feeling. I think my pull also was for my sister to have really great feminine maternal care, because we had already lost our mom at that point. My mom had died 7 years ago at that point. And so I really felt like, okay, this is a world that I'm a little bit associated with, but I'm not a mom. I haven't been pregnant. You need somebody that knows this. And so midwifery care for me, was definitely the first thing I wanted her to know about. But no, we had never talked about actual birth.
Wow. And so you got to go to her birth, and she had a 4-day labor induction, which is not that uncommon anymore, unfortunately. So what was that moment that you were like, oh my gosh, I have to get into this birth world for working?
It was the moment that the midwife looked at me and said, "Hey, come here." And at this point in my sister's induction, we had met the entire maternal team.
After 4 days, I'm sure.
Yeah. So every midwife had been on rotation. All of the attending OBs had been, and there was no emergency, but obviously all the nurses had come in, and everybody was she was known on the floor, and everybody kind of was oh, we want to be at this birth now. And I think just the way things have been going, and because it was not something I was familiar with, I was really gatekeeping. I was just so adamant. I didn't want my sister to be upset. I didn't want my brother-in-law to be upset. And they had so many people that were looking out for them and being really great. But I just, you know what I mean? There was this unspoken thing for me that I was somebody has to be there for them that knows them.
I remember that feeling. I was with my sister during her labor and birth, and that protective factor. Like you want to make a cocoon around them and keep them safe.
Yes. And I think something about when you get into the hospital, right? Because in all the weeks before her birth had come up, the induction also, I should preface, is like, it kind of happened very quickly, like the decision to have one. So we went from, I had planned her baby shower and we knew what was going to happen. And I remember thinking like, oh, if she gives birth on like a Monday, I'll have to take the day off or something. That plan suddenly just went out the window, and it was like, I have to be there for all of it. And so when the midwife said to me, when I was asked to stay was super special, and I was kind of just shocked because I also was like, oh, what do I do now? So they were in a really nice, one of the larger rooms. So I was in a chair and like was actually pretty comfortable. And because of everything that had happened, I didn't even realize, oh, this is going to be the moment now. And I have to give my sister a shout out. She's such a champ. She pushed for 25 minutes. So again, I was still thinking this was going to be hours, right? So I'm sitting in the chair and I'm just like looking at all the machines and, kind of just my brother-in-law and my sister having their moment. And the midwife goes, okay, come here. And I'm like, what? And she's like, yeah, no, you, like, auntie, come here. And I'm like, me. And she's like, yeah, that's the head. And I like peek over and I literally see the baby crowning, and just one more push and he came out and he was pink and there were legs, and I just bursted into tears. And it was like indescribable, like emotions I had never felt, ways my heart had never twanged. And even to this day, my sister and my brother-in-law actually still laugh at me because they were so relieved and they were so happy, and I was like a puddle. Like I was like crying, and not like, oh, this is like crying. The tissue, like, probably should have excused myself. But then, again, I was like laser focused though, because of course, like my brother-in-law and the nurses, and now everyone's with the baby. And I'm like, my sister.
Did you even know what a doula was at this point?
I did, but I had a different understanding of doulas. I really did think that doulas had medical training, and I thought that they were more aligned to like nurse assistants, but just for like labor and delivery.
Okay.
And I knew that there were people who were doulas like part-time. So my understanding from like traditional midwifery care and like modern day doulas, I figured, oh, this is like a role of people who don't want to be nurses full-time, or people who don't want to work in any other rotation, right? Like are only interested in labor and delivery, but still have like a certain type of schooling or traditional medical training. That was what I had thought in the past.
Yeah. But you had the instinct to as they say, mother the mother in that moment.
Yeah. And I mean, he was beautiful and I was enthralled, but I also remember like looking at my sister the entire time she was getting repairs. And granted, she only had like a 1st-degree tear. But again, I think I was the only person in the room who even cared about the placenta, because I was like, oh my God. And again, in a very traditional Caribbean culture, I had heard my dad talk about placentas my whole life.
Wow.
And which I can admit, I know the term afterbirth is not really appropriate, but that's what it was called in my family. And that's how people referred to it in the Caribbean. So again, I knew what it was, but I had never seen one, and didn't, and again, had so many kind of like funny stories from my aunts and my mother and my grandmother about how placentas were delivered, but had never seen one delivered, obviously. So that kind of was like a new fascinating thing for me, because like, right, as a woman, you're like, okay, I get my period. I've bled before. I know what kind of things happen in my vulva area. But I was like, oh.
Oh, this is a whole organ. Okay, here we go.
Right. This is a whole organ, and nobody is giving it justice, because like, what other organs come out of our bodies after they just like do a job? Like,
right?
I was just like looking at that dish for 5 minutes, like,
yeah.
Oh, that's it. This is that. Okay.
It sounds to me like you were born to do this job. I feel like you have. If you're enthralled with placentas, you're meant to be in this work.
Yeah,
That actually,
it
no,
was just
no.
funny because they asked my sister, like, oh, do you have any plans for this? And she was like, no, thanks. And I was like, I want to see. I have more questions.
I might have plans.
And
So
just for the record, like it's your sister knows you talk about her birth and how her repair went and all the details you might share.
Yes, she does. She definitely knows I talk about her birth, and she tells my nephew often. He's 3.5 now. So I think it's very endearing for my family because, again, this wasn't something that like was planned or like had been a lifelong dream. And so I think for my sister, yeah, I think she gets a little bit of like a confidence boost out of it, certainly, that she's like, oh great, I inspired you to have this wonderful career.
oh.
We joke when we text about it, she and I will say to her, like, oh, I'm talking about Christian in, an interview, and she'll be like, you're welcome.
Send
um,
my check.
yeah, basically, I know. I'm sure she's gonna ask for rights and royalties one day. But yeah, she does know, and I think that again, she's really understanding of the fact that like this conversation doesn't happen enough.
Yeah.
And I certainly think, again, right, like looking at perspectives of women, she doesn't want to do what I do, and she doesn't necessarily want to tell this story all the time, but she's aware of how important it is for the story to be told.
Right. It's so true. I mean, that actually brings me to right into our next question really well, because the fact that your family even talked about placentas is not something that's traditional in American culture, unless your mother or your, father is a birth worker in some way, right? So my mother always jokes like, when my oldest was going to go to kindergarten, she's like, you better be careful. Whatever he brings for show and tell better not be related to your line of work. Like, this is a speculum. My mom uses it to open people's vaginas, because we are very open in my family. And as I feel it should be, I feel like the research is very supportive of speaking matter of factly about, human bodily experiences, including birth and menstruation and all of these things to young children. But it is not culturally normal with our puritanical roots to do so in this country. So in April of this year, you were a featured speaker for a panel discussion hosted by the Boston-based wellness collective You Good Sis, entitled The Joy in Black Birth. This event was actually how we first met, quote unquote. I attended and was enthralled with your discussion around the cultural differences in how your West Indian family approached life events such as puberty, pregnancy, birth, postpartum time, etc., versus the modern, quote, American way of approaching things. So you, of course, have a unique perspective on this topic because while your parents were immigrants, you were primarily raised in the United States. Is that correct?
Yes.
So let's take these topics one at a time. How did your experiences with puberty or, quote, woman issues, say, differ from like your American? I know you're American, but like your, I guess white American friends that didn't have immigrant parents.
No, it's so important to talk about. And I love that also, Jeanette, you asked about Essex County because just for listeners' views, I don't mind sharing. I grew up in Swampscott, which is predominantly white and predominantly Jewish. And so like the gap culturally actually wasn't always so large because a lot of my Jewish friends had families that physically operated the way my family did, right? Like
Very interesting.
We're very large, had a lot of cultural events, had like family nearby, had a lot of support in that way. And so maybe the topics were very different, but that was very aligned. Like my parents very easily like hosted the same kind of events as like my Jewish friends' parents did. And right, like all my Jewish friends were like, my mom will feed you all afternoon. And I was like, great, because my mom will feed you all afternoon. But in terms of the topics around womanhood, I was aware from the time I was little about my female body and my vulva and that I would have breasts one day. And my mom told me probably when I was 9 or 10, you'll have your period and this is what will happen. My mom had her first period at 11. My sister did as well. And I was told that story. And my sister and I are 11 years apart. So, 6 years apart. So knowing that there would be this like transition, and again, having a teenage sibling when I was still an adolescent, my parents just were so open, like, and similar to you, Melissa, like, they didn't have conversations with my sister that they sent me away for. So even in terms of like sexuality, and when my sister started dating, or she had friends that came out to my parents before they came out to their parents, I was like allowed
Wow.
to be in the room for that. And when I say allowed, I just mean I wasn't dismissed.
Sure.
Nobody was like, hey, come learn about this, but also like didn't say you should leave now.
Right.
So I when I started my period was really funny. I was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and I went to the bathroom and I realized I had my period.
That's
And
like every teenager's nightmare, though.
Yes.
well, and you know what's so funny? I mean, I guess this relates to my whole story, and like I
Yeah.
have to give my parents credit. So I came out and I told my friend, I'll never forget. So I said to her, I think I just got my period. And she goes, you could have a baby now. And I was like, yeah, I don't think that's like for a long time. And so
I don't think
also,
it's coming out now.
right. She had a teenage sister as well. So she told her sister first, and her sister told their mother. So then her mother came downstairs and talked to us and was like, okay, honey, like, and I could tell she was like so excited, but didn't want to embarrass me.
Mhm.
And she was like, do you want to call your mom? I'll drive you home. How are you feeling? And I was like, yeah, I guess I'll call my mom. And so I called my mom, and my sister answered the phone. And that like twin telepathy that people talk about, there was like that female telepathy. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know, she just heard it in my voice or whatever, or maybe because I never called home from a sleepover before. But I was like, oh, where's mom? And she was like, what's the matter? And I was like, where's mom? And she was like, why? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, can I talk to our mother? Like, what? And like, I'm 11 years old, like in the 5th grade. And my sister's like, did you get your period? You got your period. Mom, Arlene got her period. And like that was my family. You know what I mean? And for some people, while that would be like so embarrassing and really upsetting, right? Like I was used to that kind of interaction and kind of having that. And yeah, my mom got on the phone, and I always think about this now that I feel bad for her that I didn't go home. She was so excited. And she was like, do you want to come home? I'll take you up for ice cream. What do you want to do? And I was like, I'm just gonna stay here. I just thought you should know. And so and then for weeks, my grandmother called and my aunt started calling. And every time someone in my family happened to call and I answered the phone, it was like, oh, congratulations. You're a woman now. And like my aunts had a whole like they were like, oh, this summer we're gonna take, because they live across the states. So like it was celebratory. Which is nice, because although I did have some of that like typical embarrassment and I was kind of like, oh, why'd you tell everybody? I was also like, oh, this is nice because everybody gets it. And
And they're
I
treating me special. Like, they want to do special things with me because of this.
And as the baby in the family, I finally felt like I wasn't the baby anymore. Like I got to be in like the big girls club. Because it was like truly all my female cousins, my mother, my grandmother, all 6 of my biological aunts, like everybody
That's
knew.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot of talk.
Well,
about
Marcy's probably
periods.
going to have a moon party, because I've been looking forward to having a daughter who then gets her period for a very long time. She's going to be
read
like,
about those.
Mom, oh
I
God,
love
you're
it.
so embarrassing.
I love
I am also looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So your parents are immigrants, but they did give birth to you and your sisters here in the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about your mother's birth experiences here in the States and how that was very different than your sister whose birth you attended, her experience being, induced for 4 days a few decades later? Because even though they were both in America, the experience that your mother had giving birth was very different than the experience your sister had. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked, because it also relates to why I think I felt so emboldened by my sister's birth. And why, as I've grown into an adult, the maternal mortality rates for Black women have been so shocking for me. Because I didn't have a mother or family members who truly experienced some of that. So my mom did have two very different births though. My mom had my sister in the mid 80s in 1986. My sister was born in Queens, New York. And she and my dad always described it as what could have been the most overwhelming thing for first time parents, right? They're in this huge hospital, really big maternal suite. And the way my dad always told the story was like, they go to the hospital. My mother's well into active labor is what I heard. And now I'm like, wow, I wish I had asked more about what she did until then.
Mm.
Um, and they're like walking, walking, walking. And in those days, right, it's not like nice, quiet doors that are suites. It's like curtain after curtain after curtain is how my dad described it. And so my mom had an unmedicated natural birth with my sister. Long, typical first birth, like I think 36 hours. And, was really left to her own devices. Like they were admitted, but it was like, great, let us know when you're ready to push.
And do you think that was because it was just such a busy kind of baby factory? Like they just
I
didn't have
think
the staff
so.
to, yeah.
Yeah. And I think from what my dad really, because my dad really has told his perception of the story more. I mean, my mom talked a ton to us about her body and her physical experience. But again, as some people, right, relate, my parents kind of always told our birth stories together, which that too, I really appreciate and think is beautiful because it wasn't just my mom. Like my mom wasn't dismissive of what my dad went through. And my dad also wasn't like, trying to say that it was all about him. Like his
Right.
perception of the story certainly is like, I didn't know what to do and I wasn't sure how to help. And my dad wasn't present at the birth of his first child. So again, like not a new father, but a new witness to birth. And also now witnessing a birth of his wife, right? Like wasn't married to his first partner. So like just that in terms of our our family stories, excuse me, I think was really impactful for them. Um, but so this is where like the afterbirth conversation always comes because when my mom would talk about my sister's birth, she often talked about a recovery. So she always would say to me, "Oh, that first pee is the worst pee of your life." And when I had my period and when I would get cramps, she would be like, "This is preparing you. Don't worry."
Yeah.
And she, and again, but not dismissive. Like she wasn't like get over it, but
Right.
like normalizing that this is what
Sure.
your uterus does and this is how your bleed works. So the story that is kind of funny and endearing to me is, that was their experience and they had great care. And I think my mom was in the hospital. I think at that time, right, they were still keeping people for like almost 4 days, right? Unmedicated natural birth, a woman 30 years old, healthy, fine, great. Um, and so again, this conversation about like recovery is so funny. My dad always says he was shocked that when they went home and he like said to my mom, like, okay, what do you want to do? Or like how how should we like put my mom was like, oh, let's go to Macy's. And my dad was like, wait, what? And he was like, you just had a baby. And she was like, I feel great. Like, I'm ready to get out of the house. Like, let's drop her off to my mom.
What?
Good to go.
Wow.
And so I'm sure that was like a couple of days later, but still just to me, like I grew up with a positive story of not like pushing yourself in recovery or saying that like you shouldn't recover, but that it's subjective to every woman, right? Like the story I got from my mom was that's how her birth went. She felt really good. She was able to connect with like who she was before she became a mom, right? When they had me, they were living in Massachusetts. They were now homeowners. They had really settled into like the suburban life. And I was born at Salem Hospital in 92. And so the difference of the story is that my mother's water broke. Her second labor was super short. It was like 5 hours. So her water broke at midnight. They went to the hospital. She got admitted and she's in this big, beautiful suite. And, there's like the door closes and, she's got a nurse who's with her like the whole time and no one has left since they've been checked in. And she knows she wants her epidural. So she gets the epidural and they don't have to wait. And it's great. And then I'm born and it's lovely and blissful and like no complications. And, one of the things that we joke about in my family is there are pictures of my parents with my sister going home, like when she was born, and there's her 24-hour pictures. But there's no like picture of my mother in the hospital with her. And my favorite thing growing up to see was my mom and I, our first photo is in the hospital. And she's in this beautiful negligee and her hair is combed and like she's got a little lipstick on and like the OB is in the photo. So just like an entirely different experience for
Yeah.
her that really was like what she wanted and what she needed. And I never heard my mother say she had a bad birth or that either was horrible. It just seemed very typical for her. Like that was a story I heard and was also validated by my grandmother's stories of her own birth. Like the first was kind of really long and difficult, and you're figuring out all these unknown territories. And so, right, like when we're talking about birth plans and what people want to heal from and what is different for you, I think my mom really got to have that. And I grew up with a mom who, right, like had an epidural in her second birth and was happy to and was fine with it. And from what she shared with me, like certainly didn't sound shameful or upset at all. Like she was like, no, that was the best choice. And I got it when I needed it and it was great. And I did it and it was lovely. So
lots of positive stories about birth.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, really, really
Yeah.
positive and willing to talk about it and willing to share and yeah, didn't feel like I didn't feel like the hospital, although they're part of both stories in kind of a major way, right? The distinction between like this large New York City hospital and a hospital here, Salem Hospital, but didn't feel like that had to do with my parents' choices and their perception and what they went through, and that didn't feel like the reason of why it was better. It kind of upheld that. And I think that that's something I talk about with my clients, right? About like choosing your birth location. Because I mean, I don't know. I had never asked my parents, like, would they have gone to Beverly or whatnot? And the hospital statistics are a little different now. But again, even I could just say growing up in Essex County, I didn't know people who were going to Boston to have babies until I was an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, you went to your community hospital.
right, right.
Mm.
I still wish more people did that. There's a lot of heavy marketing for those big money-making
Yeah.
hospitals.
Yeah,
Just in case.
yes, yes. And I think
Mhm.
that is something to me as a doula that's been shocking. And when people ask me, oh, what hospitals have you been to, or are you really familiar? I'm like, no, I'm actually not. Because again, growing up, to me, I was like, you go to Boston for an emergency. You
Right.
go to Boston for specialized care, for high risk care.
Not for normal healthy stuff. You don't go to Boston, drive all the way to
Right.
Boston to get a cavity filled.
Right. And like you said, normal healthy stuff. Birth is normal healthy stuff. So
Yeah.
right, like to
Yeah.
me, I couldn't imagine. And again, like none of my mom's friends or my peers who had younger siblings, like some of my friends have siblings that are younger than us, and their moms had their babies at Beverly and Salem while I was growing up. And so I didn't know anybody going 30-45 minutes away from their home to have a baby. Like that just, and again, to me, I was like, do you have time to do that?
Mm.
So your sister.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
About sister. Yeah.
So
I was going to
how
say
is her
something
experience
similar.
different?
So how is my sister different?
How is her experience different? Like I remember you
Oh,
telling
sure.
me when we spoke a few weeks ago about how your parents were just really surprised by the whole process that kind of overtook your sister's experience with the induction and the hospital and whatnot.
Yeah. My sister, I should also share, is a healthcare worker. She works in pharmacy. And so at the time, she was a technician at Beverly Hospital in their pharmacy. And I think, again, right, that understanding right there is something that people makes you feel comfortable. So again, to me, being the baby person in my family, I was thinking about really postpartum, and I was like, oh, all the medical stuff is handled because she knows where she's birthing and she's well taken care of there. And she was. I'm not saying that she wasn't, but the induction, yeah, was shocking because I actually didn't know what an induction was until my sister had one. And the conversation that I had with my dad and that I heard my dad share with either his peers or other people in my family after my nephew was born, excuse me, we had never had a premature baby in our family. That is something directly I heard my dad say, that he was like, we've never had a premature baby. I was 8 pounds 5 ounces when I was born, so like weight was not a concern. We didn't know small babies. We didn't know high risk or high needs babies.
And how many weeks was your sister's baby?
So by his birth, I believe he was 36.5.
Okay, so a little early, but he was
Yeah.
small.
And he was 5 pounds even and 19 inches. And her induction was based on his size. So earlier in her pregnancy, they had identified that his growth, right, was falling low in the chart, and he was low percentile. And there were kind of a few things that really like rolled up to it. And I think when we're talking about Black maternal health, this is something that I really reflect on now, because people often will ask me, well, do you think she had good care? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And I think when she was admitted and what I saw of the providers, right, like nothing sticks out to me, especially now as a doula and thinking about how people are treated. However, I think about the prenatal care and the fact of, and this is like not, at anyone's fault, all the conversations that I wasn't present for. And again, not knowing what you don't know. So like, if my sister had had a trained doula who could have said, you should ask this, or you should ask why they're concerned about this, and you should ask why induction is the answer for their concerns.
Right.
Those were things I was unaware of at that time.
I am not going to Monday morning quarterback your sister's birth, and I am not an OB or a midwife. But at 36 weeks, a 5-pound baby might, isn't necessarily abnormal. I mean, I have 3 6-pound babies at 38, 30, and 39, almost 40 weeks. So, there is something called IUGR, intrauterine growth restriction, and there's some ways to tell if it's that versus just what we call a constitutionally small baby, a baby that's otherwise healthy, but just maybe a little bit smaller. Someone's got to be the small kid on the chart, right? And that has to do with like, how's the head growing in proportion to the body? Because if a baby is truly not getting enough nourishment from the placenta, they will do what's called head sparing growth. So the head will continue to get bigger, but the body will stay very small because your body's very smart. It's trying to make sure the baby's brain gets enough nourishment. So, and ultrasound isn't an exact science. And there's the slippery slope argument with people who are like, well, your baby's estimated fetal weight is this, and that's close to this, which is close to this, and this would be IUGR. So, who knows what exactly happened, but what we do know is that your sister experienced iatrogenic prematurity, which was prematurity that the medical team caused by putting her into labor for an induction and then delivering a premature baby. Now, that is a risk that people are willing to take if staying pregnant is truly dangerous for the mom or the baby. But maybe, who knows the details behind that, because that's very interesting to me hearing it.
Yeah. And I think, something that has stayed with me, and I haven't actually talked about this with my sister, but again, like, you asked earlier, Jeanette, about my understanding of like midwifery care. I was relieved to hear the midwife say I'll never forget the first day when my sister said, I'm being induced. She was at an ultrasound appointment and said, I'm being induced. I'm getting set up to labor and delivery. And like my face dropped on the phone. And I got there and I went to the hospital, and I remember one of the nurses said, because I had all these questions and my brother-in-law and I were there, and she was like, well, just so you know, the baby's not going to come tonight. And I was like, okay. But then immediately in my head, I went, so why was this such an emergency like 6 hours ago?
Right.
Amen.
They couldn't go home and get a bag, really?
She couldn't go home and get a bag.
I know.
They didn't let her leave the hospital. Like, I left work, my brother-in-law left work, and we were like frantically trying to pack this bag and like, make sure we have everything.
And then they're like, how long would this take? I don't know. It could take 4 or 5 days for all we know.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh. Right.
And I remember the midwives then talking about, how an induction works that now I'm so familiar with. And she had many, 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 many doses of the cervical
Mm.
ripener because her body wasn't responding to it. And this was the very first time I ever learned about Pitocin, because a
Mm.
midwife came in and she said, I know it's been 36 hours. I know everyone's tired. I know you really want to meet your baby. I don't think we should give you Pitocin because your cervix is not ripened. And then I'm just going to administer this medicine that's going to make you contract and make you really uncomfortable and isn't doing its job. And again, that was the second time that I went, so why are we doing this?
Mm.
Like, I was like,
Yeah.
I'm so confused. And again, right? And so this is like that birth
Yeah.
keeper gatekeeping moment of it wasn't my place to ask that really.
Right. You
Um,
weren't in that role. You weren't the hired doula to bounce ideas off of. You were the caring sister. So
Yeah. And I think, and again, talking about family dynamics, I was like, well, I'm the baby sister who's never
right.
been pregnant. What do I know?
And here's the other thing too. It's like, again, especially if your sister listens to this episode, I don't want her to feel like, oh my gosh, why didn't I know that? Because it's your first time and you're trusting the people that are taking care of you, that they're giving you the best advice. We should be able to do that. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying that the baby didn't need to be born. Again, I don't know the details.
Right.
However, I do know that from working in labor and delivery for 14 years, knowing she had a 4-day induction, knowing it took so many days of cervical ripening before the labor started, she's actually really lucky she had a vaginal delivery. Places that I've worked in the past, you get 1 dose of cervical ripening, pit started the next day. The doctor doesn't even examine the patient. The nurse is told, pull the cervidil, start the pit. And then you could, contract with pit pains, we call them, because they don't do anything all
Yeah.
day long. And then they check you in the evening and say, you're still 1 centimeter. Well, you're not going to have this baby. And it's 9
Mhm.
o'clock. You're getting pretty tired, I bet. And so clearly your body's never going to have this baby,
Mm.
even though what really is your body wasn't ready for Pitocin. It's not that you're never
Mhm.
going to have this baby, it's that you weren't ready for
Mhm.
labor. And so we should just have a cesarean,
Yeah.
right? And so it's funny because on the one hand, I'm trying to put myself in your sister's shoes and I'm thinking, wow, to be so grateful that they were patient and that they took their time and that they kept on for a vaginal delivery. Clearly the baby or the mom were not in distress, which
Mhm.
allowed them to continue. But then on the other side, I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, because if the baby wasn't in distress and the mother wasn't in distress and the baby really wasn't that small for 36 weeks, why the F did they start in the first place? But this is where so many women in this country, so many birth givers are stuck feeling grateful,
Mm.
right, for a vaginal birth or for a healthy baby after a quote emergency cesarean. But when you unravel that ball of yarn, it
Mm.
turns out the medical establishment caused the whole problem to begin with and then
Mm.
patted themselves on the back and said, thank God you were in the hospital, because if you were at home, you and your baby would have died.
And
And
I
it's like just so
And
frustrating.
again, we don't have every detail about your
No, we
sister's
don't. We don't.
situation and her blood work and what else was going on with the baby and whatever
Sure.
else. But
Of
yeah.
course. No, but I think it's valid. And again, I think in having this conversation, you're so right, Melissa, because, and I think it's part of why my sister is so comfortable, because now she's like, I'm good. I know what I went through. I'm fine. I'm not mad or harboring upsetness, right? Or resentment.
Mhm.
But to your point, and I think she would definitely be okay with me sharing this. One thing we do laugh about is there was a point on day 3 where my sister like waved the white flag and literally looked at everybody in the room and was like, I'm done. Can I have a
Yes.
C-section now? And the
Mm.
nurses were like, it doesn't work like that. And she was like, no, but I'm done. Like,
Yeah.
And I don't blame her.
Right.
After
I was
being
going to
poked
say
and
it takes some
prodded for
patience
13.
on her part to go 4 days without saying, please just stop.
right. And again, like now as a birth keeper, I think about that because there was a moment where she said to me and my brother-in-law, I need the two of you to leave the room.
Oh,
Mm.
And
wow.
she had a private conversation with the nurses. And again,
Wow.
like I'm happy now, and that's right, because I am her sister and I wasn't her doula.
Mm-hmm.
I can admit that I don't talk to my clients the way I talk to my sister.
Of course, yes.
So
Right.
I'm sure I wasn't as gentle and empathetic and patient with her as I would be today. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So and this is where I'm like, I am grateful and I do feel that she had great care. And I think that the nurses in the room were understanding of the scenario. But yeah, it's a great point, Melissa. It's a great point of like, how did we get there then? And again, just to like talk to other people who maybe have gone through this, right? I was texting one of my cousins who had 2 children at the time, and I'm like giving her all the updates, right? And she's like, well, ask this, tell the midwife this. And she said to me, I texted her and I was like, "Okay, she's getting ready to push." And she was like, "Listen, call me for a minute." So I called her and I was like, "Hey, like, what's up?" And she was like, "I just want you to know in case nobody says anything," right? Based on what we knew at the time, she was like, "He's probably going to be really tiny. He's going to look like a little like pink chicken wing." That's what she said. He's going to look like a little pink chicken wing. And I should, he's also biracial. But she was right, because she, as a mother and as a person who had had 2 babies, was prepping me because I had
Mhm.
never seen a birth
Mm-hmm.
and didn't want me to think, right, this might be a full term, big,
Mm-hmm.
chunky baby that we're used to seeing. And he was fine and he was beautiful. And he, to this day, we all laugh about it. And my sister and my brother-in-law have great, great, great stories. But I was so grateful that she did tell me that, because I hadn't thought of that. And
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about premature babies, and I didn't know what happened in emergencies. And so, right, if he had been smaller or maybe not
Mm-hmm.
healthy, I would have been devastated and like not known what to do with that.
And that's beautiful that she did that, because then you were able to be calm about it. You, after you got over the crying of the joy and the
The emotion.
oxytocin filled room, and
Yeah.
then you were like, oh, who's taking care of my sister? So let's talk about like that instinct of postpartum. So you were an early education teacher, so you're already ready for babies, and you worked in daycare centers and took care of babies that were little, but usually they're not that little or that young, right? So like maybe 6 weeks, but it'd be great if some of them would, have more time before they have to go back to work and have daycare. But so how did all of your thoughts of like going back to work or taking care of babies at daycare, like how did that change after your nephew came?
Oh man, I this is really a family effort that I am so proud of and so grateful for. And I want to just preface this statement I'm about to make, not shaming anyone or judging anyone for the state that frankly our country is
Oh,
in with
absolutely.
Totally.
parental care, right, and paternal leave. My dad felt very adamantly that he didn't want my nephew to go to daycare for as long as possible. And again, not from a trust point of view, because here I was working in a daycare,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
but for him. And I think that was really from a cultural perspective, right? Not having my mom to help my sister in her recovery, I think my dad felt like this is the thing I can do. This is
Hmm.
where I can protect you. So my sister and my brother-in-law were living with my dad at the time, and which again is so great because my parents had that experience of an intergenerational home. My mother lived
Mm.
at home until she was 29, until she married my dad, really.
Wow.
And so I never thought about that. Like the bond between my nephew and my dad it's so special. It's so sweet. Um, but so my sister was home, and again, though, talking about postpartum, my dad was there. She had someone in the house every single day. My brother-in-law didn't have time off. And then especially having emergency time off for the 4 days that my sister was
Mm-hmm.
in the hospital. I think he did take like his week vacation after the baby came, and that was really it.
Mm.
So I was comforted knowing my sister wasn't literally in a house alone,
Yeah.
Mhm.
but my dad is not the person to like change diapers and hold a baby and burp them, and right. So the what postpartum looked like for my sister kind of shifted. My dad could go to the grocery store, help
Mm-hmm.
with errands, pick up dinner, make sure my sister had food, bring her a snack, but he wasn't ready to like take care of a baby. um
Well, plus
so
a small baby like that makes people nervous anyway.
Mm.
yes, yes. And so I went to see my sister every single day after work,
Mm.
because I was like, okay, have you slept? Have you taken a shower? Have you had a snack? Dad, go and get us dinner, and I'm gonna change the sheets, and I'm gonna do the dishes, right? And so, and again, it wasn't even, oh, let me come by and help out. Just every day, my sister, and I think also my sister was just wanting me around. So every day she was like, hey, text me after work, text me after work, text me after work. And I wanted to see my nephew. So I would go over every day, and yeah, she would take a shower or take a nap, or I would give him a bottle, or, even just we would sit together and watch TV. And again, you know, she'd be like, oh, it's like nice to have someone to talk to.
Mm.
Right. And then, of course, like my brother-in-law would come home and he wanted to spend time with the baby and catch up with my sister. And I was like, okay, what are you guys doing for dinner? Because it's 7 o'clock and everybody needs to eat and you need to get to bed in the next 2 hours because this baby's going to be up. Right. Like that's where me being an educator really kicked in. And again, culturally, I'm sure people, right, are listening and are like, maybe like, oh my God, you sound like my mother-in-law, which is awful. For us, that was comfortable.
Yeah.
That was okay for me to say to my sister, lie down, sit down, stop getting up. I would never talk to a client like that. Ever, 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 ever. But it was okay in that comfortableness,
Sure.
right? But it did really break my heart when I went back to work and had these 6-week-olds in my class that I loved and I knew and had their parents in my face every morning. And I was like, my sister doesn't have to do that.
Right.
And again, it created the weirdest, most complex feeling I've ever had about a job.
Oh,
Because
I can imagine.
I was so proud and happy to do the work I was doing. And then I felt utter guilt.
Mm.
And I was like, oh. And again, it really made me slow down and look at every new parent that walked in my classroom, every child's first day. And also, I think it made me a better teacher for my colleagues because, right, there were some seasoned teachers who were like, oh, so and so's mom cries every morning. Oh, this person doesn't think we know how to change diapers. And I started to realize, like, it can't be us versus them. Like, it
Right.
can't be,
Totally.
right? And like, so there were a couple teachers that I would have conversations with and be like, hey, so and so's mom isn't just like crazy and neurotic. She's really sad and she's 6 weeks postpartum
Yeah.
and she doesn't want to leave her baby and she doesn't actually really know us. Even though we know we're good teachers, she doesn't actually really know us, right?
Mhm.
Right.
So like,
And again, I do not say this in a judgment way.
Mm-mm.
I went back to work. I had to utilize babysitters. But in a human biological way, leaving your baby with a stranger is not biologically normal. People should not have to do that. But in a modern American society where we're so separated from our
Mm.
families, where we need two working parents to even survive, and two working parents, you're sometimes still living under the poverty line. Like,
Mm.
you know, American parents are put in an impossible situation. I am not saying that people who put their babies in daycare, that's not normal and that's bad. It's just, it breaks my heart too.
Mm.
Because, it's funny. The reason why I reached out to you, Arlene, when I saw you speak at that, The Joy of Black Birth, is because when you were talking about your family and your intergenerational family, and it so much reminded me of the way that I grew up, even though I do not have Caribbean parents. But my, I, not too far back in my family lineage are immigrants. And if you heard my grandmother's episode when she came on and talked about her births in the 1950s and how her mother came to take care of her and all of the old remedies. And I grew up in an intergenerational household. I had a great grandmother in my life when I was a kid, which many people do not. I lived, my mom and my sister and I lived with my grandmother and grandfather and my uncle for quite a few years growing up. When we moved, my mother got remarried. We moved into a house next to my stepdad's parents. So like I very much grew up with it was just assumed that the grandparents would be there to help you and care for you and feed you dinner and get you off the bus and all that stuff that so many modern families don't have. They don't have that, and they have no other option.
right. And my dad and I had that conversation when my nephew was born, right? The shift in one generation, how things happen because of tragedy. I think my dad was very emotional to see me and my sister and my nephew in the living room where 25 years ago it was me as the baby, my mother, and my grandmother. My grandmother came and stayed with us for 2 weeks when I was born. And again, there was no, and the conversation was different. Like my dad also went back to work right away, but there's mixed feelings there, right? I'm sure some people would be like, well, didn't he feel bad not getting time with you? But he wasn't nervous because my grandmother was there.
Mhm.
Right.
And my aunt was around the corner, right? And so there was a cultural piece, like you're saying. And same thing, my mom, when they came to the States, my grandmother came with her children. My grandfather was already here, and they moved into an apartment building where my grandmother's sister was living
Right.
with her husband and her children, the floor above them. And then they moved out and they bought a duplex together. Right. So like my mom always says, like she grew up with her cousins like siblings.
Right.
And it was the same thing. And so, when my parents moved out of New York, that was like shocking to my grandparents. How could you move away from us? How could you be more than forget more than a state, like more than a drive, more than 2 blocks. And so I really personally took that into my work and really made it my own mission to like have my parents in my classroom like me and trust me. And I'll admit now, like I broke a ton of rules because like I texted parents and I took pictures on my phone, not to keep but to send to parents. And right, and I wrote extra notes and I did extra projects when I could, because I was so aware of like, while people were happy to see their babies thriving and meeting milestones and having this socialization, I was like, there are broken hearts
Right.
at home every night that I get to do this and they don't.
I have a feeling this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship between us, Arlene, because I am also a rule breaker.
Yeah, I'm like, I hope none of my former directors are listening.
Don't get me wrong. I like order. I like rules, but sometimes the rules don't make sense, and you have to do what's right for the client.
Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Alrighty, that is the end of episode 1 with Arlene Lammy. And I hope you enjoyed her storytelling and that you won't miss. It's the part 2 of this episode, which we've divided. So go hear episode 64 and you'll be able to hear Arlene even more. And we hope you enjoy that. But thanks for listening.